Have you ever noticed how debt doesn't just sit quietly on a balance sheet? It follows you. It creeps into your thoughts when you wake up and presses on your chest when you try to sleep. That moment when you open your banking app and your stomach tightens. That split second of dread when your phone rings from an unknown number. You tell yourself you're being responsible, you're working harder, you're budgeting better, and yet, somehow, the weight never really lifts. What if I told you this cycle isn't random? What if the reason money leaves as fast as it arrives has nothing to do with intelligence, effort, or discipline? What if the real issue operates on a level most people never think to look at? Joseph Murphy spent decades studying the relationship between spiritual law and material results. And what he uncovered challenges almost everything we've been taught about debt, money, and effort. This is not about hustling harder. It's not about another consolidation plan. And it's not about positive thinking in the shallow sense. This is about alignment with a law that has existed for thousands of years. A law that doesn't care how educated you are, how hard you work, or how unlucky you think you've been. A law that responds only to understanding and authority. And there is one psalm, just one, that Murphy saw repeatedly break cycles of debt and reverse financial loss when spoken once a day with awareness. Not begged, not repeated obsessively. Spoken once. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear may explain patterns in your life you've never been able to make sense of, and more importantly, it may show you how those patterns finally end. Think about this carefully. Have you ever paid off one bill only for another expense to appear almost immediately? A car repair, a medical bill, a sudden fee, right when you were starting to breathe again. Most people call this bad luck. Murphy didn't. He noticed something else, something disturbingly consistent. People who struggled financially weren't just dealing with numbers. They were trapped in repeating spiritual agreements they didn't know they had made. Agreements reinforced every day through words, beliefs, and emotional states. Debt, in this sense, isn't just financial pressure, it's bondage. And bondage always begins in the unseen before it manifests in the visible. That's why working harder often doesn't fix it. You can pour more money into a system that's leaking and still never fill it. Until the leak is sealed, effort only delays the inevitable. This is where most financial advice fails. It treats debt as a mechanical problem instead of a spiritual pattern. Joseph Murphy understood that money responds to consciousness. It follows belief. It moves toward conviction. And it withdraws from fear. The scriptures say that life and death are in the power of the tongue. Most people hear that and think it's poetic. Murphy took it literally. Words are not descriptions, they are declarations, and what you declare consistently becomes law in your experience. Every time you say, "I'll never get ahead," something listens. Every time you say, "Money disappears the moment I get it," something agrees. Every time you say, "This is just how my family has always lived," a pattern is reinforced. But here's the truth most people never hear. You don't break a spiritual pattern with effort. You break it with authority. And authority is exercised through the spoken word, aligned with truth. The psalm I'm talking about is Psalm 112. But before you rush to read it, understand this: the power isn't in the ink on the page. The power is in what happens when those words are spoken with understanding and certainty. Psalm 112 is not a prayer of desperation. It is a declaration of order. It describes what is already established for a person who aligns with divine law, not someday, not after years of suffering, but as a present reality. It begins by stating that the one who aligns with divine truth is blessed, that their house contains wealth and riches, that their stability is unshakable, that they are not afraid of bad news, that they lend and do not borrow. Read that again slowly, not hoping to lend, not dreaming of abundance. It states it as fact. Most people read this and assume it refers to someone else, someone more holy, someone more deserving, someone luckier. Murphy saw that assumption alone was enough to keep people trapped. The moment you see scripture as observation instead of participation, you remove yourself from its effect. When you speak Psalm 102, you are not asking God to change your situation. You are declaring that you are stepping into alignment with what already exists. That distinction changes everything. Here's why this works so quickly for so many people. Your subconscious mind does not respond to logic. It responds to authority and repetition. When you speak something once with full conviction, it carries more weight than repeating words 100 times while doubting them. Murphy taught that the subconscious accepts what is impressed upon it emotionally and authoritatively. And once impressed, it begins rearranging circumstances to match the new command. That's why this practice requires speaking the psalm only once a day. Not because repetition is bad, but because authority doesn't shout, it declares. When people first begin this, the initial shift is rarely external. It's internal. A strange calm replaces the constant financial anxiety. The mental noise quiets. The sense of doom eases. This peace is not emotional placebo. It is a signal. It means resistance is loosening. Then something interesting happens. Small changes begin appearing. A delay that once caused panic now resolves smoothly. A call that once brought fear brings relief instead. An unexpected opportunity shows up without struggle, and then often within days, tangible shifts begin. Debts reduce, payments arrive, resources appear from places people didn't anticipate. Not because money magically falls from the sky, but because the inner agreement with lack has been replaced. You see, money doesn't move toward desperation, it moves toward order. And Psalm 112 establishes order. Joseph Murphy observed that people who used this psalm didn't chase money afterward. They stopped hunting. They stopped grasping. They stopped forcing outcomes. And paradoxically, that's when money returned. Because fear repels, peace attracts. Debt thrives in an atmosphere of anxiety. Abundance flows in an atmosphere of certainty. Now listen carefully, because this is where most people sabotage the process without realizing it. They speak the psalm, and then immediately undo it with their inner dialogue. They declare wealth, and then check their account with dread. They speak provision, and then complain about bills all day. They affirm abundance, and then replay fear-based stories. Words spoken with authority must be protected by silence afterward. This doesn't mean pretending problems don't exist. It means refusing to reinforce them emotionally. Murphy was very clear about this. After making a declaration, you let it work. You don't dig up the seed to see if it's growing. Faith is not emotional excitement. Faith is refusal to interfere. There's another reason Psalm 112 is so effective. It doesn't just address money, it addresses identity. Debt doesn't just drain finances. It reshapes self-perception. It makes people feel scorpable, less deserving, less confident. 112 restores identity first. It says the righteous are steady, they are generous, they are respected, they are not shaken by fear. Their heart is established. Once identity shifts, behavior follows naturally. Decisions improve. Opportunities are recognized. Confidence returns. This is why breakthroughs feel sudden from the outside, but they were forming internally long before. Murphy documented countless cases where people tried everything else first. Budgets, courses, side hustles, loans, and nothing worked. But when they addressed the spiritual agreement beneath the pattern, everything else began working effortlessly. Debt didn't leave because it was fought. It left because it no longer belonged. That distinction matters. Now let's talk about how to do this properly. Choose one time of day, morning or night, it doesn't matter. What matters is consistency. When you speak Psalm 112, speak it aloud, not quietly, not in your head. Your voice carries authority, your thoughts do not. As you speak, personalize it. Do not say the person. Say I. Do not say their house. Say my house. You are not stealing a promise. You are claiming alignment. Speak it once, slowly, calmly, confidently. Then stop. Do not repeat it again that day. Do not argue with your mind. Do not check for results. Let it settle. Over the next few days, pay attention not to money first, but to your emotional state. Is the fear less loud? Is the tension easing? Are you thinking more clearly? Those are signs the agreement is changing, and when the agreement changes, the results must follow. Murphy explained it this way: the outer world is the shadow of the inner world. You cannot change a shadow by attacking it. You change the object casting it. Psalm 112 changes the source. This practice has ended debt for people who had no logical way out. It restored finances where effort failed. It brought peace before it brought money, and that peace is what allowed money to return. If you've been trapped in cycles you can't explain, if money leaves faster than it comes, if progress never seems to last, this may not be because you're doing something wrong. It may be because you've never addressed the agreement itself. Speak the psalm once a day. Let silence guard it, refuse to argue with fear, and watch what begins to shift. Because when authority speaks, resistance ends. There is something else you need to understand about why this works, something Joseph Murphy emphasized again and again. Because without this understanding, people either give up too early or try to force results and unknowingly slow the process down. Money does not respond to urgency, it responds to stability. Debt creates urgency, fear, pressure, mental noise, and urgency pushes money away. That's why panic decisions usually make things worse. That's why quick fixes almost always backfire. Urgency signals lack. Stability signals sufficiency. Psalm 112 does something subtle but powerful. It stabilizes the inner world first. It establishes the heart. It removes fear of bad news. It creates emotional neutrality where there used to be panic. And neutrality is magnetic. When fear leaves, clarity enters. When clarity enters, you begin noticing things that were always there but invisible under stress: options, conversations, timing, connections. Nothing supernatural has to fall from the sky for this to work. The unseen rearranges the scene. This is why people often say, "I don't know why, but things just started working out." They did not become luckier, they became aligned. There's a reason Psalm 112 specifically mentions not fearing bad news. Fear of bad news is the emotional doorway through which debt maintains power. That flinch when the phone rings, that tension when you open your email, that constant bracing for impact. When that reaction dissolves, debt loses leverage. Murphy noticed that once people stopped fearing money-related communication, outcomes changed dramatically. Conversations softened, negotiations improved, solutions appeared where resistance used to be. Fear collapses possibility, calm expands it. Now let's address something important, something people are often afraid to admit. Many people secretly believe debt is punishment. Punishment for mistakes, for ignorance, for bad decisions, for not knowing better earlier in life. That belief alone can keep debt alive for years. Psalm 112 carries no punishment language, none. It doesn't say wealth comes after suffering. It doesn't say riches are earned through pain. It states abundance as a natural condition of alignment. This is critical. As long as someone believes they must suffer to deserve freedom, they will unconsciously sabotage relief when it arrives. They will feel uneasy when things go well. They will expect the other shoe to drop. The psalm dissolves that expectation. It says your heart is established, not waiting, not hoping. Established. An established heart does not anticipate loss, and what you no longer anticipate stops manifesting. This is why the practice must be gentle. No striving, no emotional pushing, no desperation. Authority does not rush. When people ask, "How long will this take?" Murphy would often answer, "As long as it takes for you to stop resisting it." Sometimes resistance dissolves quickly. Sometimes it takes days. Sometimes a bit longer. But once it dissolves, momentum shifts rapidly. Here's another pattern Murphy observed. People who practiced this began receiving money they were already owed, forgotten payments, delayed reimbursements, unclaimed refunds. This is not coincidence. These are funds already assigned to them, previously blocked by confusion, delay, or oversight. When order returns internally, order returns externally. Others notice debts shrinking in unexpected ways, interest adjustments, settlements, reduced balances, not always dramatic, but consistent. And consistency matters more than spectacle. Spectacle excites the mind. Consistency rewires the life. Now listen carefully to this part, because it's essential. You do not speak Psalm 112 to get money. You speak it to remove the obstruction to money. This is why the instruction is once per day. Anything more turns it into chasing. Anything less turns it into neglect. Once is alignment, more is effort, less is doubt. One declaration signals completion. After that, your role is not to watch but to live. Live as someone whose situation is in transition, not crisis. That means you continue handling practical matters responsibly, but without emotional charge. You pay what you can without resentment. You communicate without fear. You plan without dread. These small shifts compound quickly. And there's one more thing, something almost no one talks about. Debt often attaches itself to identity narratives passed down through families. Stories like, "We're just not good with money. People like us always struggle. Rich people are different. This is normal for our family." These are not observations. They are agreements. Psalm 112 doesn't just bless the individual. It mentions generations. It breaks inheritance patterns. When someone in a family line stops agreeing with lack, not angrily, not rebelliously, but calmly, the pattern loses continuity. Murphy saw this repeatedly. One person practicing alignment altered outcomes for spouses, children, even extended family, not through force, through example. Peace is contagious. When one person stops panicking, the household stabilizes. When the household stabilizes, decisions improve. When decisions improve, outcomes follow. This is not mysticism. It is cause and effect operating through consciousness. If you've tried everything else, if nothing has stuck, if progress always reverses, this is not another thing to try. It is something to allow. Speak the psalm once, let it land, protect it with silence, and watch how debt loses its grip, not through struggle, but through irrelevance. Because when alignment is restored, lack has nothing left to stand on. And when the agreement ends, the cycle ends with it. There's a moment that comes after you've been living under pressure for a long time, a moment that can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, and that moment is quiet. Not excitement, not celebration, quiet. And for many people, that quiet is unsettling. When the nervous system has been trained to expect urgency, chaos feels normal. Calm can feel suspicious. The mind looks for something to worry about, something to fix, something to brace against. This is why some people unknowingly interrupt their own breakthrough. They mistake peace for inaction. They mistake calm for stagnation. They mistake silence for nothing is happening. Joseph Murphy warned about this exact phase. He said this is often the most important stage of the process, the moment when the old pattern has lost power, but the new one hasn't fully manifested yet. This is the space where faith matures. Not emotional faith, settled faith, the kind that doesn't need reassurance. If you reach this stage, do not try to speed things up. Do not add more declarations. Do not search for signs. That impulse comes from the old agreement trying to reassert itself. Stillness is not delay, it is integration. When the subconscious accepts a new command, it reorganizes everything beneath the surface. Priorities shift. Perceptions adjust, responses soften, and from the outside, it can look like nothing is changing until suddenly everything does. This is why breakthroughs often feel sudden. They aren't sudden. They're the visible result of an invisible reordering that's already complete. Murphy used to say that when you no longer feel urgency about money, money begins to feel urgency about you. That sentence alone explains why this psalm works where force fails. There is also something deeply important about the emotional tone you bring when you speak Psalm 112. It is not meant to be spoken with excitement or pleading. It is meant to be spoken with calm certainty, the same tone you would use to state your own name. You don't argue with your name. You don't hope it's true. You simply know it is. That's the tone. If emotion arises while speaking fear, grief, relief, allow it, but don't amplify it. Let it pass. Emotional release often signals that old tension is leaving the body. Afterward, return to neutrality. Neutrality is not indifference, it is stability. And stability is the emotional state that abundance recognizes. Now, there's another subtle shift that begins to happen when this practice takes root. You stop telling your story the same way. You stop introducing yourself internally as the one who's struggling. You stop narrating your life through debt. You stop mentally rehearsing worst-case scenarios. This doesn't happen because you force optimism. It happens because the story no longer fits. Psalm 112 installs a new narrative, one of steadiness, provision, and trust. And once a narrative changes, behavior follows effortlessly. People notice they stop making panic purchases. They stop avoiding financial conversations. They stop procrastinating simple actions that once felt overwhelming. None of this feels dramatic, it feels natural. That's how real change feels. Dramatic change excites the mind. Natural change transforms the life. There's also something important to understand about timing. The psalm does not operate on your schedule. It operates on readiness. Readiness is not about deserving. It's about non-resistance. Some people see results in days, some in weeks. But in every case Murphy documented, the internal shift preceded the external one. If you judge the process too early, you reintroduce resistance. If you allow it to unfold, it completes itself. One of the clearest signs that the process is working is this: you stop mentally rehearsing debt. You no longer run numbers obsessively. You no longer imagine future emergencies. You no longer feel the urge to fix everything at once. Instead, you deal with what's in front of you, and only that. Presence replaces panic, and presence is powerful. This is why the psalm mentions not fearing bad news. When bad news no longer provokes fear, it loses its power to shape outcomes. Fear amplifies, calm neutralizes. People often report that situations which would have spiraled before now resolve cleanly. Conversations end better than expected. Solutions appear without stress. Not because life becomes perfect, but because resistance is gone. Here's something else that may surprise you. As debt begins to loosen its grip, generosity often increases naturally. Not forced generosity, but ease. A willingness to give without fear of loss. Psalm 112 mentions generosity for a reason. Giving from fear reinforces lack. Giving from ease reinforces abundance. When you give calmly, even in small ways, you signal trust, and trust accelerates flow. This doesn't mean giving recklessly or ignoring responsibilities. It means letting go of the belief that every dollar must be guarded anxiously. Money circulates where it's trusted. Now let me be clear about something, because confusion here can derail people. This practice does not replace practical responsibility. It supports it. You still act wisely. You still communicate clearly. You still take reasonable steps, but you no longer carry emotional weight while doing so. Effort without anxiety produces better outcomes than effort fueled by fear. And over time, you may notice something subtle but profound. You no longer define freedom as being out of debt someday. You begin experiencing freedom now. Peace first, provision second. That order matters. Joseph Murphy understood that the mind cannot sustain abundance while clinging to fear. One must be released before the other can fully arrive. This psalm releases fear gently. And when fear leaves, debt has nowhere left to hide. If you've been waiting for a sign, if you've been searching for the missing piece, if you felt like you've done everything right and still ended up stuck, this is not about doing more, it's about agreeing differently. Speak the psalm once a day, let calm replace urgency, allow alignment to do its work, because when the agreement changes, the outcome must follow. And when resistance ends, money returns naturally. There's a final layer to this that Joseph Murphy spoke about quietly, almost cautiously, because he knew how easily it could be misunderstood. Debt does not cling to people who feel safe. It attaches itself where insecurity lives, where the future feels threatening, where the mind is constantly preparing for loss. That internal posture creates an environment where instability feels familiar, and familiarity invites repetition. Psalm 112 dissolves insecurity at the root. Notice what it emphasizes again and again: steadiness, confidence, an unshaken heart. These are not poetic descriptions, they are conditions. And conditions determine outcomes. When the heart is steady, decisions become cleaner. When decisions are cleaner, consequences soften. When consequences soften, momentum shifts. This is how cycles end. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet replacement. One pattern loses fuel, another takes its place, and eventually, the old one simply stops appearing. This is why many people don't even notice the exact moment debt ends. They just look back one day and realize it no longer has the same authority. The fear is gone, the urgency is gone, the emotional charge has vanished, and without emotional charge, debt becomes manageable and then irrelevant. There's also something important about how this practice changes your relationship with time. Debt creates future obsession, constant projection, constant, what if constant mental travel into worst-case scenarios. Psalm 112 brings you back into the present. When you're present, you stop leaking energy into imagined disasters. That reclaimed energy strengthens clarity, and clarity improves everything. This is one of the reasons money begins to return. Not magically, but naturally. You notice opportunities sooner, you respond instead of react, you speak more clearly, you negotiate from calm instead of fear. People treat calm differently. Vendors respond differently. Employers respond differently. Institutions respond differently. Calm communicates stability, and stability invites cooperation. Joseph Murphy observed that once fear left, resistance from others softened. Situations that once felt adversarial became collaborative. Problems that once escalated now resolved quickly. This wasn't coincidence, it was resonance. The outer world mirrors the inner one more precisely than most people are comfortable admitting. Now, here's the part that requires trust. You don't need to understand how this works fully for it to work. Understanding helps, but agreement matters more. When you speak Psalm 112 once a day with certainty, you are not convincing God of anything. You are convincing your own consciousness to stop fighting reality. And when the fight ends, flow begins. If doubt arises, and it may, don't suppress it. Don't argue with it. Simply return to the practice the next day. Authority doesn't argue, it repeats calmly. Doubt loses power when it isn't fed. You may also notice that your language begins to change organically. You stop saying, "I can't." You stop saying never. You stop saying always. Those words are anchors, and when they fall away, movement resumes. This is why the instruction is so simple. Once a day, one psalm, one declaration. No rituals, no emotional strain, no urgency. Simplicity is strength. Complex systems break, simple ones endure. If you felt drawn to this message, it's not because you're desperate. It's because something in you recognizes stability when it hears it. That recognition matters. You don't need to force belief. You don't need to feel confident. You only need to be willing to stop reinforcing fear. Speak the psalm, let the day unfold, return tomorrow. That's it. And over time, sometimes quietly, sometimes suddenly, the cycle loosens, the pressure fades, and money returns to its proper place, a tool, not a threat, not something chased, not something feared, something that flows. Because when the heart is established, when fear is absent, when alignment is restored, debt has no ground left to stand on. And when that ground disappears, something unexpected happens. You stop measuring your life by what's missing. That constant mental scoreboard, what you owe, what's overdue, what's coming next, slowly loses relevance. Not because responsibility disappears, but because dominance does. Money stops being the loudest voice in the room. And when money is no longer the loudest voice, wisdom becomes audible. This is one of the least discussed effects of this practice. As pressure fades, intuition sharpens. You begin to sense when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to stay silent, when to move and when to let something resolve on its own. Joseph Murphy often said that intuition is blocked by fear. When fear leaves, guidance returns. That guidance is what leads people to make the exact decision that changes everything. The phone call made at the right moment, the offer accepted instead of rejected, the opportunity recognized instead of overlooked. From the outside, it looks like chance. From the inside, it feels obvious. This is why people often struggle to explain how things turned around. They didn't do one big thing. They simply stopped fighting and started aligning. Debt thrives on friction. Alignment removes friction. And when friction is gone, movement is inevitable. You may also notice something else. You become less reactive to other people's financial stories. Panic no longer spreads to you. Complaints don't hook you. Headlines don't hijack your nervous system. This isn't denial. It's insulation. Psalm 112 creates emotional insulation. It doesn't promise the absence of challenges. It promises stability in their presence. That stability is rare. And rarity attracts resources. People trust those who are steady. Systems respond better to those who are calm. Opportunities flow toward those who aren't desperate. This is why money begins to return not only through one channel, but through many small ones. The accumulation matters less than the direction. Flow replaces force. At some point, you may realize something profound. You are no longer waiting for freedom. You are living from it. And from that place, debt becomes solvable, not overwhelming. Manageable, not defining. Temporary, not permanent. This is the quiet victory Psalm 112 brings. Not fireworks, not drama, resolution. If you've listened this far, trust that it wasn't accidental. Messages resonate when they match readiness. You don't arrive here by chance. Speak the psalm once a day. Let it settle. Let it work. And resist the urge to rush what is already in motion. Because when alignment is restored, outcomes rearrange themselves, and what once felt immovable begins to move. Gently, naturally, finally. And when you look back, you won't remember the exact day the debt ended. You'll remember the day the fear did. And that's when everything truly changed. And that change is subtle at first. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply settles in. One day you notice you slept through the night. Another day you realize you opened your bank app without flinching. A conversation about money ends without tension. These are not small things. They are evidence. Evidence that the inner climate has shifted. Joseph Murphy often reminded people that the subconscious mind speaks through feeling, not language. When the feeling changes, the command has been accepted. And once accepted, the outer world has no choice but to comply, because it always follows the inner lead. This is why chasing signs can slow the process. The need for reassurance is itself a form of fear, and fear tries to resurrect what has already lost its footing. Let the process be quiet. Quiet things endure. Another change often surprises people at this stage. Patience returns. Not forced patience. Not the kind that grits its teeth and waits, but a natural patience that knows timing is no longer an enemy. This patience removes desperation from action. An action taken without desperation is far more effective. You respond instead of react. You choose instead of scramble. You move from clarity instead of panic. This is how momentum builds without strain. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, money begins to behave differently in your life. It stays longer, it moves more efficiently, it stops vanishing mysteriously. Not because you're controlling it more, but because you're no longer pushing it away emotionally. Money resists pressure. It responds to ease. There may come a moment when you're tempted to tell someone about what you're doing, to explain the psalm, the practice, the shift. That's fine, but it's not necessary. Authority doesn't need validation. Results speak quietly on their own. And you'll notice that people start asking different questions. Not how are you surviving, but how did you figure that out? Not are you okay, but what changed? When those questions come, you'll realize something important. The cycle is already broken. Not because everything is perfect, but because nothing feels hopeless anymore. Hopelessness is the real debt. Money was never the root. Fear was. And Psalm 112 removes fear by replacing it with certainty, not certainty about numbers, but certainty about order. Order always wins. So if today feels ordinary, let it be. Ordinary days are where lasting change settles in. The dramatic days get remembered, but the ordinary ones do the work. Speak the psalm tomorrow, and the day after, once, calmly, without urgency, and trust that what is rearranging beneath the surface is doing so precisely, intelligently, and completely. Because when the heart is established, when fear no longer speaks, when alignment is restored, the debt ends not with a battle, but with a quiet conclusion, and money doesn't rush back. It returns, because it finally can. There's a point where you realize you're no longer doing this practice. It's simply part of your day. You speak the psalm not with effort, not with expectation, but with familiarity, like checking the weather, like locking the door, like brushing your teeth. It becomes a quiet act of alignment, not a dramatic event. And that's when its effect deepens. Because what changes a life is rarely intensity. It's consistency without strain. Joseph Murphy understood that the subconscious mind accepts what feels normal. When abundance is spoken calmly, without emotional spikes, it stops feeling like a fantasy and starts feeling like a baseline. And once something becomes a baseline, reality organizes itself around it. This is when you may notice that your reactions to setbacks are different. Something unexpected happens, and instead of panic, there's a pause. You assess, you respond. The situation resolves without spiraling. That pause is everything. In that pause, fear has no voice. And when fear has no voice, it has no power. You might still have debts at this stage. Bills may still exist, but the relationship has changed. They no longer define you. They no longer dominate your emotional landscape. They've lost their authority, and authority is what sustains patterns. Without authority, patterns dissolve. This is also when people stop seeking proof. The need for proof fades because certainty has already settled. You don't need signs when you're no longer afraid of outcomes. This is the paradox most people miss when you stop needing money to feel safe. Money begins to move more freely toward you. Safety attracts supply, fear repels it. Psalm 112 establishes safety internally, and from that safety, everything else follows. There may come a moment, weeks or months from now, when you suddenly realize something else has shifted. You trust yourself again. You trust your judgment, you trust your timing, you trust your ability to navigate challenges. Debt erodes self-trust. It teaches people to doubt their decisions, to second-guess, to hesitate. Psalm 112 restores that trust quietly, and self-trust is invaluable. When you trust yourself, you stop making fear-based choices. You stop agreeing to unfavorable terms. You stop underestimating your worth. You stop settling. These changes don't announce themselves, but they reshape outcomes profoundly. This is how the cycle truly ends. Not just because numbers change, but because the person who created the old pattern no longer exists. Alignment doesn't fix the past, it replaces the future. If you're wondering whether you're doing it right, let that question go. The very fact that you're calmer than before is the answer. Speak the psalm once a day. Let the rest of the day be ordinary. Ordinary is where permanence lives. And one day, without ceremony, without drama, you'll realize the weight is gone. Not just lighter gone. The fear that once framed every decision is absent. The urgency that once drove every thought has dissolved. That's when you'll understand something simple and profound. The debt didn't end because you fought harder. It ended because you stopped feeding it. And money didn't return because you chased it. It returned because nothing was pushing it away anymore. That is the quiet power of alignment. And once that realization settles in, something even deeper becomes clear. You were never meant to live braced for impact. That constant readiness for something to go wrong, the tightening in the chest, the mental scanning for threats, that was never wisdom. It was conditioning. And conditioning can be undone. Psalm 112 doesn't teach you to ignore reality. It teaches you to stop surrendering to fear. There is a difference. Fear anticipates loss before it arrives. Wisdom responds only when action is actually required. When fear leaves, energy returns. Mental energy, emotional energy, creative energy. And that reclaimed energy begins to express itself in ways that matter. Ideas come more easily, solutions feel simpler. You stop overcomplicating. Joseph Murphy often pointed out that many people are not blocked by circumstances, they're blocked by exhaustion. Fear drains clarity. Clarity restores momentum. This is why, as alignment deepens, life starts to feel lighter even before circumstances fully change. You're no longer carrying tomorrow's problems today, and carrying less weight allows you to move faster without rushing. At this stage, something subtle but powerful happens in how you relate to money itself. It stops feeling personal. It stops feeling moral. It stops feeling like a measure of your worth. It becomes neutral. Neutrality is freedom. When money is neutral, you make better decisions. You don't cling. You don't avoid. You don't dramatize. You simply engage with it as a tool. Tools work best when they're not feared. This is why Psalm 112 never frames wealth as obsession. It frames it as presence. In the house, quietly, naturally, without spectacle. That's the kind of abundance that lasts. Not the kind that spikes and crashes. Not the kind that brings anxiety with it. But the kind that stabilizes. As this stabilization continues, you may notice your sense of time shifting again. The urgency to catch up fades. You stop measuring your life against imaginary deadlines. You're no longer late. That belief alone lifts enormous pressure. So many people live as if they're behind where they should be, behind where others are, behind some invisible standard. Debt feeds on that belief. Psalm 112 removes it. It places you back in the present, where action is possible and panic is unnecessary. And from that place, progress accelerates quietly. One payment clears, one balance reduces, one opportunity appears, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. Steadiness is underrated. Steadiness is unstoppable. And then there comes a moment, often when you're not thinking about money at all, when you realize the story has changed. The future no longer feels like a threat. It feels open. That openness is what people mean when they talk about freedom. Not the absence of responsibility, but the absence of fear. If you've reached this point, trust that the process is already complete internally. The external world is simply catching up. Continue speaking the psalm once a day, without emotion, without urgency. Let it remain what it was always meant to be, a declaration of order. Because order, once restored, does not collapse again. And the life that grows from that order is not frantic, not fragile, not fleeting. It is calm, it is stable, it is sufficient. And from that place, money doesn't need to be chased. It arrives because everything else is finally in its place. And that is the part most people never expect. They assume freedom will feel loud. They imagine relief as excitement. They think resolution will announce itself. But real resolution is quiet. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need validation. It simply becomes the new normal. Joseph Murphy often said that when a spiritual law has been accepted, it stops feeling miraculous and starts feeling obvious. You don't marvel at it anymore. You live from it. This is how you know the cycle has truly ended. You're no longer waiting for things to improve. You're no longer measuring progress daily. You're no longer negotiating with fear. Life resumes. And when life resumes, money takes its proper place. Supportive, secondary, functional. Not central, not threatening, not defining. You may still remember how heavy things once felt, but it will seem distant, almost unreal, like recalling a storm after the sky has been clear for a long time. That memory doesn't return to scare you, it returns to remind you. To remind you that pressure was never your natural state. That panic was never wisdom. That struggle was never your identity. Psalm 112 didn't give you something new. It restored something original, a sense of order, a sense of trust, a sense of steadiness. And from that steadiness, everything else flows naturally. You don't need to protect this state aggressively. You don't need to guard it anxiously. Anxiety is what created instability in the first place. Simply continue. Speak the psalm once a day. Let the rest of life unfold. If doubts appear, let them pass. If old thoughts surface, don't argue with them. Authority doesn't debate. It remains. And over time, what once felt impossible becomes unremarkable. Bills that once felt crushing become manageable. Decisions that once felt overwhelming become simple. This is how freedom feels when it's real. Not dramatic, not fragile, just present. And one day, without marking the calendar, without making an announcement, you'll realize the debt no longer defines your story. Not because it vanished overnight, but because it no longer belongs. And money, it didn't rush back. It didn't explode into your life. It returned because there was finally nothing left pushing it away. And when nothing is pushing it away, life begins to feel cooperative instead of combative. You stop feeling like you're moving against an invisible current. Days stop feeling like something to survive. Problems stop stacking on top of each other. Things still happen. Life doesn't freeze, but they no longer pile up in the same way. One thing resolves before the next arrives. Space opens, breathing room appears. That space is everything. Space allows perspective. Perspective allows choice. Choice restores dignity. Joseph Murphy believed that dignity was one of the first things debt quietly steals. Not loudly, not obviously, but subtly. Through hesitation, through self-doubt, through the habit of apologizing for circumstances that were never a reflection of worth. Psalm 112 restores dignity without argument. It doesn't say you must prove anything. It doesn't say you must earn rest. It simply states what is true when alignment is present. And when truth is stated calmly, the nervous system relaxes. When the nervous system relaxes, behavior improves. When behavior improves, outcomes follow. This chain is simple, and simplicity is powerful. At some point, you may notice that you no longer feel the need to explain your situation to yourself or anyone else. The internal narrative softens, the justifications fade. You are where you are, and it's enough to move forward. That acceptance is not resignation, it's strength. Resistance drains energy, acceptance redirects it. This is why people who reach this stage often find solutions that once felt invisible. Not because the world changed, but because perception did. You see what's useful instead of what's threatening. You notice openings instead of obstacles. You respond to reality instead of arguing with it. That shift alone can change everything. There is also something quietly liberating about no longer tying your emotional state to numbers. When money stops determining mood, it loses control. Control is what sustained the cycle. Release is what ends it. Psalm 112 gently teaches release, not by force, but by replacement. Fear is replaced with steadiness. Urgency with patience, panic with trust. And trust, once installed, doesn't need reinforcement. It holds on its own. This is why the instruction never changes. Once a day, one psalm, no strain. Strain implies doubt. Calm implies certainty, and certainty is what reality responds to. You don't need to monitor progress. You don't need to compare timelines. You don't need to wonder if you're behind. Behind what? Life is not a race you're losing. It's a process you're aligning with. As alignment deepens, the sense of being chased by consequences fades. You stop living defensively. You stop planning from fear. You begin living forward again. And living forward feels lighter. Eventually, the old habits dissolve completely. The mental rehearsals, the late-night calculations, the imaginary disasters, they simply don't arise anymore. Not because you suppress them, but because there's no fuel. Fear requires attention to survive. Without attention, it starves. And when fear starves, debt loses its strongest ally. What remains is clarity, and clarity is quietly powerful. This is why people who experience this shift often say the same thing in different words. I don't know exactly when it changed, it just did. That's how real change works. It doesn't interrupt life, it integrates into it, so continue. Not with effort, not with intensity, but with steadiness. Speak the psalm, live the day, repeat tomorrow, and trust that what is aligning now is doing so fully, intelligently, and completely. Because when order is restored internally, when fear no longer dictates, when alignment replaces resistance, the cycle ends. Not temporarily, not conditionally, but finally. And the life that follows is not defined by debt, not haunted by fear, not driven by urgency. It is defined by ease, guided by clarity, and supported by a quiet, steady flow that no longer needs to be chased. That is what returns first, and everything else follows naturally after. And as that flow steadies, something important settles into place, perspective. You begin to see that the struggle was never a permanent sentence. It was a phase sustained by fear, habit, and misunderstanding. Once those dissolve, the situation loses its intensity. Intensity is what kept everything locked. Without intensity, nothing grips. This is why so many people are surprised by how ordinary freedom feels when it arrives. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like exhaling. It feels like returning to yourself. Joseph Murphy often said that when the mind stops fighting life, life stops fighting back. That cooperation is not dramatic, it's dependable, and dependability is what builds real stability. At this stage, the psalm no longer feels like something you're using to fix a problem. It feels like something that keeps you oriented. A reminder of order, a grounding point. You don't need to think about debt all the time anymore. In fact, you may forget about it for hours, then days, and when you do think about it, it no longer carries emotional weight. That's the sign the cycle is truly over. Emotion was the glue. Without emotion, nothing sticks. Money begins to behave differently because you're no longer relating to it from a place of threat. You're no longer trying to control outcomes. You're cooperating with them. And cooperation always outperforms control. You might notice that when challenges arise, and they will, as part of normal life, they don't spiral. They resolve, sometimes quickly, sometimes gradually. but always without panic. That absence of panic is the victory, because panic is what turned manageable situations into ongoing problems in the past. Now, you meet things as they are, and things respond accordingly. This is the quiet intelligence of alignment. It doesn't remove responsibility. It removes distortion. And when distortion is gone, reality becomes workable again. If you ever find yourself tempted to return to old habits, checking compulsively, worrying ahead, bracing for impact, don't judge it. Old patterns fade gently when they're no longer fed. Just return to the simplicity. Once a day, one psalm, calmly spoken, then live. Life doesn't need constant correction. It needs trust. And trust, once established, doesn't need to be proven every day. You'll know you've crossed into something new when you stop asking, "Will this work?" and start living as if it already has. Not arrogantly, not recklessly, but naturally. That naturalness is the signature of real change. The debt ends not because you forced it to, but because it no longer matches who you are. And money returns not because you demanded it, but because there is finally space for it to stay. That is the power of order restored. That is the effect of fear removed. That is the quiet conclusion of a cycle that once felt endless. And from here forward, life doesn't feel like something you're trying to escape. It feels like something you're finally moving through, steady, present, and unburdened. And moving through life this way changes more than finances. It changes how you relate to yourself. You stop questioning every choice. You stop replaying old mistakes. You stop defining the present by the past. Debt has a way of anchoring people to who they used to be. Every bill feels like a reminder. Every balance feels like a judgment. Psalm 112 quietly severs that link. It doesn't erase memory, it removes identification. You are no longer the person who messed up. You are no longer behind. You are no longer catching up to a life that's already passed you by. You are simply here and moving forward. That forward motion doesn't need speed to be effective. It needs direction. And alignment provides direction effortlessly. Joseph Murphy often spoke about how the subconscious mind responds when it no longer feels threatened. It becomes cooperative, creative, efficient. Instead of scanning for danger, it scans for solutions. This is why ideas start coming at unexpected times, in the shower, on a walk, while doing something ordinary. Solutions don't arrive when the mind is tense. They arrive when it's relaxed. Relaxation is not laziness, it's receptivity. And receptivity is what allows supply to enter. At some point, you may realize that you no longer talk about money the same way, even internally. The language softens. Absolutes disappear or never fade out of your vocabulary. Those words were prisons. Letting them go opens doors. You begin to think in terms of flow instead of shortage, timing instead of threat, adjustment instead of collapse. This doesn't mean everything becomes perfect. It means everything becomes workable. Workable is powerful. When life feels workable, confidence returns. And confidence changes how others respond to you. People sense when someone is no longer operating from fear. Conversations shift. Opportunities arise naturally. Not because you're trying to impress anyone, but because fear is no longer shaping your presence. Presence without fear is compelling. This is why many people notice changes not just in money, but in relationships, health, and overall well-being. The same fear that distorted finances was often affecting everything else quietly. Remove fear in one area, and the effect ripples outward. Psalm 112 doesn't target symptoms, it restores balance, and balance is the foundation of everything sustainable. You may one day realize that you no longer feel the need to protect yourself from life. You stop expecting resistance everywhere. You stop bracing for disappointment. You engage more openly. Openness invites cooperation. Cooperation accelerates progress. This is the rhythm that replaces the old cycle, not up and down, not feast and famine, but steady movement forward. And steady movement doesn't exhaust you. That's another sign of real change. You're no longer tired all the time. Not physically, but mentally. The background stress that once drained you is gone. That reclaimed energy becomes available for living, not surviving. And survival was never meant to be permanent. If you ever wonder whether this stability will last, remember this: it's not built on circumstances. It's built on alignment. Circumstances change, alignment holds. Continue speaking the psalm, not to fix, not to chase, but to remain oriented. Orientation keeps you steady when things shift, and from that steadiness, life continues to organize itself in your favor quietly, intelligently, without force. This is not a temporary improvement, it's a structural change. And structural changes don't reverse easily. They become the new normal. A normal where debt no longer dictates identity. A normal where money is supportive, not stressful. A normal where the future feels open instead of threatening. That is the real ending of the cycle. Not an event, not a moment, but a return to order. And once order is restored, nothing needs to be forced again. And when nothing needs to be forced, life begins to unfold with a kind of quiet cooperation that feels almost unfamiliar at first. You stop pushing against days. You stop waking up braced. You stop carrying tomorrow's weight into today. This doesn't mean challenges disappear. It means they no longer arrive with a threat attached to them. They're just situations, and situations can be handled. That distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Joseph Murphy often explained that the mind cannot solve a problem it feels threatened by. Threat collapses intelligence. Calm expands it. When fear exits, intelligence returns, and intelligence always finds a way forward. At this stage, you may notice that your sense of urgency around money has dissolved completely. Not because you have enough yet, but because you no longer believe catastrophe is waiting around the corner. That belief was the real trap. Without it, time opens up. Decisions become cleaner. Life feels navigable again. This is also when gratitude begins to arise naturally, not forced gratitude, not I should be thankful gratitude, but quiet appreciation for stability, for clarity, for peace. Gratitude doesn't create abundance, it confirms it, and confirmation stabilizes what's already forming. You may find yourself appreciating small things again, a clear conversation, a simple meal, a moment of ease. These moments aren't distractions from progress. They are signs of it. Abundance begins as a feeling long before it becomes a figure. And when that feeling settles in, money starts behaving differently almost without effort. It circulates instead of sticking. It supports instead of stresses. It arrives when needed instead of vanishing unexpectedly. This isn't because you're manifesting. It's because resistance is gone. Resistance was expensive, ease is efficient. If someone were to look at your life from the outside during this phase, they might not immediately see dramatic changes, but they would feel something different when they're around you. Calm, groundedness, certainty. These qualities are magnetic, not in a mystical sense, but in a human one. People trust them, systems respond to them, opportunities align with them. Fear repels support, stability attracts it. And stability is exactly what Psalm 112 installs, not temporarily, not emotionally, but structurally. This is why it continues working even on days when you don't feel inspired, even on days when you're tired, even on days when nothing seems to move. It's not dependent on mood. It's based on order. Order doesn't need enthusiasm, it needs consistency. So you continue. Once a day, one psalm, no commentary. You don't need to reflect deeply every time. You don't need to analyze. The work is already underway. At some point, you may even forget to think about results. That's not negligence, that's trust. Trust is the final release. And when trust is complete, outcomes accelerate quietly, things resolve, balances change, situations untangle, not always in dramatic ways, but in permanent ones. This is the kind of change that doesn't reverse because it wasn't built on effort. It was built on alignment, and alignment, once restored, doesn't drift on its own. It holds. So if you're still in the early days, let that be enough. If you're in the quiet middle, don't rush it. If you're noticing peace where there used to be panic, recognize it for what it is. It's working, not loudly, not urgently, but completely. And one day, without ceremony, without a finish line, you'll realize you're no longer living in response to debt. You're living from stability. And from that place, money doesn't need to be chased, feared, or controlled. It simply flows where it's welcome. And now, finally, it is. And when it's welcome, it behaves differently. It doesn't rush in and disappear. It doesn't arrive with strings attached. It doesn't demand anxiety as a price of entry. It settles. Settling is the sign that something has found its place. For a long time, money never stayed because fear never left room for it. It fills every corner. There's nowhere for stability to land. Psalm 112 clears space, not by removing responsibility, but by removing tension. And tension was the barrier all along. This is why the return of money often feels quieter than expected. It doesn't come with shock, it comes with normalcy. Bills get paid. Balances reduce. Choices feel less constrained. Nothing about it feels magical. And that's how you know it's real. Magic excites briefly and fades. Order persists. You may one day notice that you're planning differently. Not defensively, not pessimistically, but realistically with a sense of continuity. You make decisions assuming stability instead of collapse. That assumption shapes outcomes more than any strategy ever could. Assumptions are powerful. For years, the assumption was something will go wrong. Now the assumption becomes this will work itself out. That shift alone changes everything. And it doesn't require effort to maintain. It holds because it feels true. Joseph Murphy taught that when the subconscious accepts a new truth, it no longer needs reinforcement. It acts automatically to preserve it. That's why the practice never escalates. That's why it never demands more. Once a day remains enough. At some point, you may stop thinking of this as a practice at all. It becomes a quiet anchor, something that keeps you oriented, not something you rely on for rescue. Rescue implies danger. Orientation implies direction. You are no longer being rescued from your life. You are moving through it with clarity. And clarity brings confidence. Not loud confidence, not performative confidence, but quiet certainty. The kind that doesn't need to be proven. That certainty shows up in how you speak, how you pause before responding, how you choose what matters and what doesn't. And slowly, without fanfare, the story finishes rewriting itself. The chapter that once felt endless closes without drama. There's no final confrontation, no sudden victory speech, just absence. The absence of fear, the absence of pressure, the absence of that constant background noise that once shaped every thought. In that silence, life continues lighter, steadier, more cooperative, and money finally is just part of that life, not the axis it spins on. This is the ending most people never imagine because it doesn't look like an ending at all. It looks like peace. Speak the psalm tomorrow, and the next day, once, calmly. Not because you're afraid to stop, but because alignment is something you maintain, not something you chase. And trust that what has rearranged itself internally will continue to express itself externally, not hurriedly, not dramatically, but faithfully. Because when order is restored, when fear no longer leads, when steadiness becomes the norm, the debt ends. And what returns is not just money, but ease, clarity, and the quiet confidence that nothing is chasing you anymore. You're no longer running, you're simply living. And that is where this truly completes. Not with a promise shouted into the future, not with excitement meant to carry you for a moment, but with something far more powerful, certainty. Certainty that you are no longer trapped. Certainty that the cycle has been interrupted. Certainty that what once felt endless has an ending. You don't need to monitor it. You don't need to prove it. You don't need to explain it. The fear that once followed you has already lost its grip. And without fear, nothing has leverage over you anymore. This is why Joseph Murphy emphasized simplicity above all else. Not because life is simple, but because truth is. When something is true, it doesn't require for its own. Speak the psalm once a day, let it be calm, let it be final. Then live. Live without bracing, live without rehearsing loss, live without dragging yesterday into today. And trust that what is now aligned within you will continue to express itself outwardly, steadily, reliably, without drama. The debt ends because it no longer fits. Money returns because it finally has space. And you move forward not as someone escaping a problem, but as someone restored to order. Quietly, naturally, completely. This isn't the beginning of effort, it's the end of resistance. And from here on, life no longer feels like something to survive. It feels like something you are finally allowed to live.